St. Andrews, and then about coming to St. Andrews in the first place, and then we can just use that as a launching point for the rest of the discussion and for some questions that the students might have.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you for inviting me to come and talk. I feel like a voice from the Middle Ages because I suppose for all of you, well, not all, but most of you here, the 70s is ancient history, and it's something that you read about in a book. But from my perspective now, the 70s was prime time. It was a wonderful time for change in American life. And to have been a part of that, as I now look back on it, was just a rare opportunity. Not so much to be an agent of change, but to be a part of what now turns out to be a very important movement. Well, two important movements, the women's movement and the anti-war movement, which ultimately led, as you all know, to the end of the Vietnam War. My husband and I, my husband was English, and he's now dead. He was chaplain here at St. Andrews, and I taught in the history department. We came as a twofer in 1971. I was in graduate school at Cornell, finishing up a PhD in history, and he was an Englishman, dean of a theological college in England, and we had met when he was here in the States on a speaking tour, but then later we met more significantly and ultimately decided to leave what we were doing and get married. So this meant we had to find a job. Well, this is not an easy thing to do. And I had thought, oh, it'll be perfectly easy to find, you know, this sort of thing. Oh, no way. And so we got more and more desperate as we, on both sides of the Atlantic, we didn't get married until the summer. We were looking for some place to light. And as often happens, it was chance that brought us to St. Andrews. But I'll tell you, having lit here, we stayed. The then headmaster, Bob Moss, was looking for a one-year sabbatical replacement for the chaplain who was going on a year's sabbatical leave. So he phoned around to various colleagues at prep schools around the Eastern Seaboard and said, anybody know anybody who's available for a year sabbatical? And it just so happened that a friend of mine, who was chaplain at Hotchkiss, had heard, I had sent out a letter to everybody I knew saying, you know, anybody here of any jobs, let me know. And so he phoned Bob Moss and said, well, I've had a letter and I know her and I can say that she's okay. I don't know anything about him, but if she's marrying him, he must be okay. So on the strength of that, Bob Moss, the headmaster here, phoned my husband long distance in England. Now this was not as ordinary a thing then as it is now, and said, I booked a flight for you from Heathrow to Philadelphia. Nan will meet you, and you're coming for a weekend job interview. Well, then he phoned me to tell me this, and so it happened. I drove down from Ithaca, New York, picked up my fiancé at Philadelphia Airport. We changed clothes in a field outside of Middletown into interviewing clothes, and then drove here to St. Andrews and spent the weekend. At the end of the weekend, we were both offered jobs. Wow, what kind of procedure is that for hiring? Whew. Anyway, that settled the job problem. And so we moved down here in August of 73? Yeah, must have been 73. And this was for a 1-year sabbatical replacement. But by October, the headmaster had decided that we were a very good thing and that he wanted to keep us on. And so he made overtures to my husband, and who said, "Oh no, I am not taking a man's job who's on sabbatical. No, no, no." Well, what can we do? It was easy to create a job in the history department, but not so easy in the chaplaincy. So he said, "Aha, I will split the task. I will have one of you as chaplain and one as head of religious studies." Okay, that took care of that. And so my husband became the chaplain, and I became the first academic woman to teach at St. Andrews. And this did not make me popular with faculty wives, let me tell you. All of whom were well-educated women. They had met their husbands in college or graduate school, but there was no place for them at St. Andrews. And so they were just faculty wives. And so for quite some time, I mean like years, I kept getting the sort of treatment that was like, why you and not me? I've been here. You know, I'm well educated. Why you? And there's no way you can deal with that except by doing it. And so Simon and I settled in on Lower Pell with as good a grace as we could muster, without many friends. That took a while. But I enjoyed the teaching from the very beginning. It was an all-boys school. That was the last year of single-sex education at St. Andrews, all boys. And we had 8th grade boys on Lower Pell. No, sorry, 9th grade. 8th grade were in the dorm, upstairs dorm. And so Pell, that was his last year as for the school as an all-boys school. And I found out later that the Board of Trustees had decided the year before to go coeducational. And so they had told the headmaster to start looking for some good women. And here I came. So I didn't know anything about that at the time. I just thought, oh, I'm being hired, thank goodness, to have a job. And the early years here for being the only woman teacher, it was not an easy road to hoe. It was an all-male school with all-male traditions. There wasn't even a women's bathroom in this building. If visiting moms had to go to the bathroom or something, their son would take them up on corridor and stand outside the men's room while they used the facilities. Well, this was not good enough. And so I began a quiet crusade for, first of all, equal facilities, and then for equal treatment. When I became pregnant with our son, the health, we had to pay all the costs ourselves because no teaching member of the faculty had ever gotten pregnant because they were all male. And so the next year an exception was made for me to be covered on the school's health plan. Thanks. Looking back on it now, it seems another era. But St. Andrews went through all this as everybody did. Oh, I can tell you stories. Oh, I have so many stories. Being the only woman teacher, you're subject to all sorts of things. For instance, I taught a 9th grade class, and one day they decided to play a trick on Mrs. Mein. And so they all hid under the table. And I came in and sort of put my stuff down, looked around, and surprise! Oh, thank you. And then I had to exercise, well, you know what adolescent boys are like. I had sometimes to exercise my authority more vigorously. And one day a boy was sent to me. I was in my classroom and he knocked on the door. I came out and he said, "I've got a message for you, Mrs. Mein. You're supposed to go somewhere. I can't remember where it was. And do this and that and the other." And I, being of a naturally kind and trusting nature, you know, I was willing to do this. But the more he talked, the more peculiar it sounded. And so I said to him, "Are you telling me the truth?" He looked at me and he said, "No, ma'am." And so I lost my temper with him at that point, which was bad. So I just picked him up, shook him up, put him up against the wall and said, "Don't you ever do that to me again." Well, word quickly spread down the corridors about this. Woo, nobody messed with me after that. So it isn't all persuasion. Sometimes you have to demonstrate what you're doing. The history department was in a time of change, and it had been a lockstep curriculum. 9th grade, ancient history; 10th grade, European history; 11th grade, what was 11th grade? American history; 12th grade, more American history. So I was fresh from graduate school and saw that this was perhaps not the way historical studies were trending. And so I suggested that perhaps we might consider offering an elective. Oh, my dear. But who would do it? Who would do it? Oh, I said, "I'll do it." Oh, okay. So I designed a course which I titled, probably provocatively, Problems of Democracy. Well, now, this is at a true blue school that sent as many graduates into Annapolis and West Point as they could, and everybody saluted the flag. And there was a long tradition of going into the military. The idea that democracy could have problems. So I took a rather different approach to the teaching of history than had been common. Turned out to be the most popular class in the school. I ended up teaching 3 sections of it. I had to keep my toe in to American history. But my training had all been in European history and in particular the Renaissance and Reformation periods. So this was all new stuff for me, but I figured I was young, and you know, you can do anything. Yeah, easy. So that began the change in the history department curriculum. How many electives do you have now, Emily?
All of the advanced study classes are elective.
Oh, they are.
So other than U.S. history that the third formers take, all of the rest of the courses are elective.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Good. as I said, it quickly became the most popular of the electives, which did not endear me to my male colleagues, I can tell you. But, you know, that's the way it is. And we continued to live on Lower Pell, and we were there for 11 years. I had been, at Cornell, I had been a TA and a head resident of a small girls' dorm. So I was prepared for this sort of thing, which was a good thing, because I'll tell you, the boys, all these, some of the boys, the first boys, they were duck boot wearing denizens of the lower eastern shore who thought that the only thing to do on a weekend was to hunt, you know, go out and kill ducks and geese and so forth. And they'd clomp around the school in their gear and so forth. I was a walking provocation to them. And so the sorts of things that were water poured in our windows, if we left the ground floor windows open, we lived in Lower Pell, kids would hurl buckets of water in the living room windows. Oh. And I would phone up the corridor masters, who's been off corridor? Oh, I have no idea, no idea. And so forth. So it was not easy being being the first woman at St. Andrews, but we survived and in fact thrived. It turned out to be a very good place for all of us, and so I stayed forever. And in fact, here I still am.
Nan, can you talk about, you were mentioning the response of some of the faculty wives, the tea cart that was brought around. Can you tell that story?
Yes. In the good old days, there was a tea break every morning, and the kitchen would prepare, literally, I'm not joking this, a tea cart, you know, with a big wheels and made of nice wood, and there was a silver tea service, and it was wheeled down by the kitchen to the faculty common room every morning so that the masters could have their tea, their mid-morning tea. And so the first time I appeared on the scene, one of the men, I was the only woman, one of the men said, "Oh, are you going to be our tea lady now?" Ha 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 ha. And I said, no, actually, I prefer to style myself as did Elizabeth I, Queen of England, who always signed herself Elizabeth Rex. Rex meaning king, monarch. And the man said, ha ha ha, all right. So that dealt with the tea tray issue. Nobody asked me to pour tea after that. Nor did any faculty wives pour tea after that. They had been liberated from tea duty. And it was discovered that men could actually pour their own tea. Would you believe it? Change comes slowly to St. Andrews.
I don't have tea at all.
So can you talk a little bit about just the conversations that you were a part of? So once the trustees told Bob Moss that coeducation would in fact happen, sort of the conversations that you were in that were a part of the sort of planning for coeducation and sort of how that began to unfold.
Ah, yes. Very few schools were co-ed in the 70s. Virtually every private school certainly all the boarding schools in the country were single sex. And to have a fully co-ed boarding school was just beyond the bounds of thought. A couple of the New England schools were co-ed, but they had totally separate buildings, campuses for boys and girls. And so the first plans that the trustees had was to build a separate campus across the pond for girls and to hire another faculty, in effect, or to ask the present faculty to commute by bicycle or raft, I suppose we could have done. But that was vetoed, I think wisely. And so they said, well, it's either full co-education or nothing. So we'll go whole hog. So the first year, my first year here was a planning year in which we divided, the faculty were divided up into communities. We went round to other boarding schools because everybody, well, many of the boarding schools were considering co-education at that point. And so we'd go around and talk with other schools who were planning. Turned out that turned out to be probably the most successful of the schools that went fully co-ed. And within a few years, we had groups visiting from other schools who said, we hear that you're doing a good thing up there. We'd never heard of St. Andrews, but can we come and visit? Which was very nice. So in many ways, what we did here at St. Andrews in terms of full equality for girls from the very beginning was helpful in the East Coast's progress towards co-education. Does that?
Yeah, what were some of the challenges? During, I know you've talked about before, despite what you're saying about ultimate sort of successes of co-education, tell us some of the stories of sort of what those first couple of years looked like in terms of the experience of the girls, even that you were working with on Pell, what their experiences in the classroom were.
Those first girls were tough. They really had to be tough because certainly the older boys, the juniors and seniors, particularly the sixth form who ran the school, did not like the thought of having girls here. This is an all-boys school, always has been, always will be. And so they harassed the girls. Oh, water in the windows, as I said. Various sort of games. They would line up, the boys would line up in the dining hall between classes and form a gauntlet so that any girl who was moving from one end of the building to the other had to run this gauntlet of staring boys. One of the girls complained to me about it, and I said, well, I had no idea this was going on. And so I went and watched the next day and then sent my flying squad in of young male coaches to deal with the situation. And didn't happen again. And then it was such a simple thing as waiting at table. It was assumed that the girls would be waitresses at sit-down meals. And virtually all the meals, in my very first year here, even breakfast was a sit-down meal. Can you imagine it? Oh, it was awful. A sit-down being, oh my God, don't want to think about it. And so lunch and dinner were served meals. And so it was assumed that the girls would do all the waiting. No way. So we instituted immediately a rotation so that everybody, well, sixth formers didn't have to wait, but fifth and lower, everybody took their turn waiting at table. And rewriting the student handbook. Now this may not seem like much, but we had a little thing, rules for St. Andrews, the student handbook. Do you still have a handbook? going through that and changing all the pronouns. You miss one pronoun, oh, then you have to go back, I don't want to think of that. And as we checked for typos, it became clear that the whole handbook was written from a male perspective. And so the whole thing had to be rewritten. Needless to say, by those who wanted to do it, which were the younger ones, the young women who had been hired, all helped in. People like Mr. Spears and Mr. Roach, who were ardent advocates of coeducation. And so we really rewrote the structure of the school to make sure that girls had full and complete access to every committee, to every activity, that there wasn't anything, sports, for instance. We had to make sure that there were girls' sports which were fully competitive and not just intramural volleyball sort of thing. And of course the girls became, they joined there weren't many, the day schools. We compete with the Wilmington day schools. And our girls, I suppose due to the austerity of life at St. Andrews, were always in far better shape than the Wilmington preppies. And so St. Andrews quickly got the reputation of being tough, which didn't hurt. Emily, you're going to have to prompt me.
So can you talk a little bit about, and I know, in your classroom it looked different than in some of the other teachers' classrooms, but I know you were counseling and mentoring the girls on dorm. What sense did you get of among the first girls or that first generation of girls at St. Andrews? What was their experience like in the classroom initially?
Ooh.
How were male teachers responding to them and reacting to their presence?
Right, good question. As part of our planning for girls, we made sure that at the registrar level, that every class that had one girl had at least 3, so that there would be not just one girl alone in a classroom of all guys. This may not sound like much, but it's very important to have a backup voice to your own voice. And so this meant that a fair number of classes didn't have any girls. And we get complaints from teachers saying, I want to teach girls. And saying, well, you have to wait your turn until we can become more fully coeducational. Because we started out with just 14 on lower Pell and 10 on upper Pell. So that isn't a lot of girls to go around. And we lived, as I said, on lower Pell. And so just about every evening, at the end of the day, there's a nice big fireplace in that living room. We would have a fire, and the corridor would come in, we'd make s'mores, and just have a sort of bonding. The girls thought they were just having fun, but as far as I was concerned, it was a real exercise in bonding, apart from the classroom and the athletic field. And this was important because there were so few girls. It's hard for you girls now to think what it was like to have only like this classroom full of girls in the whole school. And things were very slow to change. A lot of the older faculty, well, there were a few men who left rather than teach girls once it was announced that the school would go co-ed. But there were a few, can I call them crypto, anyway, who cooperated, but who were subtly.
Didn't Louisa Zent originally run for the position of, quote, head boy?
Yes, she
Wasn't that
did.
what it was called?
Yes, yes. It was just called the head boy because it had always been a all-male school. And Louisa, you know Mrs. Zent? You know Louisa Zent? Well, she's one tough lady now. And she was a tough teenager, believe me. And so she said, this isn't right, and I'm gonna run. And so she ran, and not a chance of election. No way. And so that was a clear indication that we needed to change the system. If the students won't choose equality, then we will mandate equality.
Well, I want to let's see if there are some questions that
Oh.
the students have, and then I have some other things I can prompt you with. But are there things that you all are interested in asking Mrs. Mead about?
I'm curious about the mothers of the girls that came and how did the I know it's a different era. Did the parents ever get involved in the treatment of the females on campus, or did they leave that up to the school? As I would see, yeah.
It was completely left up to the school.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. And in fact, every fall there would be Father's Weekend. Since this had been an all-boys school, you know, obviously women were not important. And so all the dads came on campus. Oh, and my dear, the bad old days. The kitchen would deliver crates of liquor to the faculty apartments because the dads would make their way around to the faculty to talk about their children and to have a little slug of old granddad or whatever. And so this quite quickly, we began, you know, we said, perhaps we ought to change this a little. And there was one mother who always came to Father's Weekend. She was a mother from Smyrna. She was one tough lady. Her boys were at the school. And so she, Mrs. Orth, she came. And quickly, the next year we put out the invitation to all parents. And quite quickly, mothers began coming as well as dads, which certainly changed the atmosphere of the, well, it made possible a parents' association and not just, you know, dads.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I don't know, so this is a simple history question. When was St. Andrews desegregated? Was that before or after it became coeducational?
I'm sorry, I can't hear.
When was St. Andrews desegregated? Was that before or after we went coeducational?
Before we went co-ed, there was one black student, Everett McNair, was a black student who was here when we came. He was I think he was a junior. He graduated, went to Annapolis, had a career in the Navy. And then Bob Moss had not had any backing at all from the trustees. But there was a change, a sort of a feeling that maybe this isn't quite right. And so he was encouraged then to bring in minority students. I'm not going to say more minority students because one doesn't really count. And so there's I don't know if there still is, but there was an agency in Philadelphia that provided, it was called Prep for Prep. And, yeah, and provided a good experience preparation for minority students to go to boarding schools. And so we signed up for prep and had a wonderful experience with them in terms of the preparation they gave and the ongoing support through the year. Because we had had several experiences on our own of trying to bring in, I just ached for the first black girls on my corridors. They had such a terrible time. There was one black boy, Everett McNair, and there were 2 black girls on my corridor. And they had, with the best will in the world, everyone was trying to make everybody feel at home and so forth, but it just isn't the same. And so we quickly became clear that until we had a substantial minority and Asian presence in the school, we weren't doing the right thing. And so we hired Prep for Prep to help fill the ranks. Does that answer? Yeah.
Were there moments during the early years of coeducation when either faculty who had been skeptical or male students who had been skeptical, when they sort of saw something and pointed to it as evidence that coeducation was a bad idea, where they sort of tried to make the argument that this had been a mistake?
Oh, all the time in the first years. Any girl put a foot wrong in any kind of way there. Look, did you see what she did? Did you see what she said? Did you see what she spoke up in class? Whoa, the thought. So a fair number of the senior faculty were highly skeptical about coeducation. In fact, of total coeducation. A few girl day students would have been acceptable, but to have them right here on the spot was more than a lot of the senior men were able to deal with. And so a fair number took early retirement, moved to another school. Woodbury Forest was at that time a favorite place because it was all boys. They went to day schools where they wouldn't be forced to live with the other sex.
How do you think the architecture of the school, of founders as where the boys live and the girls, you lived in Pell, that was actually initially built for boys, but that comes to
Architecture
be
is
good.
destiny, let me tell you. When we were planning for girls' admissions, we looked at every building on campus and tried to see how can we adapt this campus to coeducation. And we considered taking one of the corridors upstairs and turning it into a girls' corridor. Whatever the corridor is over the front bit,
Hillier?
Hillier. There were thoughts of making Hillier into a girls' dorm. We weren't really up for filling one of these long corridors with girls, but we thought, maybe a shorter group. But then there were some fairly conservative people on the board of trustees who said, security. And so we want our girls to be safe. And where's the safest place? Pell. A separate building. And so it just so happened that there are 24 spots there, which was a reasonable number of girls. We didn't fill Pell the first year, because you can't just sort of fill everything and then say, well, what about the next year? And so we took 3 years to build up to the full 24 girls. In the meantime, plans were launched with the architect to build Moss. And so the plans from the beginning had been to move up to, well, the goal still, I think, is 50-50. And then the plans for places across the gully, you know, with the sacred gully, could we build out towards the pond? Oh, heaven forfend that we should spoil that view. And so that was next. But yeah, it took a while before it was really, there was a substantial girls' presence. Because even 2 or 3 in a class is not like half the class. And 2 or 3 young women in the English department isn't like all the male coaches. But it, you know, it took a while. And part of the problem was that there's always a substantial turnover among younger faculty. You know, people come, stay a few years, move on to another school, move up and out and so forth. And so every school does its share of integrating new people, young people, into the teaching profession, but then they move on. And so we're doing the same. But it just got harder and harder to keep young corridor people.
Then, how was the reception when, you know, for years we only had obviously male presidents, and the move to have co-ed presidents? I'm curious to see that transition, to hear a little bit more about that transition when we ended up having co-presidents.
We had to mandate it, and so we decided not to just do it for the seniors, but to have every school function be equal. In other words, there's always a boy and a girl head of whatever. And girls on the discipline committee, girls can be just as tough on their peers as, in fact, often tougher than boys are. But I don't know if it still is mandated or if it just happens. No, it is mandated. Yeah.
This goes back a little bit to the desegregation. But what would you say were your observations of the similarities in being one of the first girls and one of the first students of color, and then the differences in the experiences?
I'm
what
sorry,
was-
can you say that
what
again?
was similar, I guess, if you were a white girl, one of the first white girls, and a black boy at the school in the early 70s, and what was different? Or could you even compare those experiences?
Well, first of all, this didn't become apparent to us. It should have been early, but it didn't. Middletown is at the northern edge of the rural South. And going into town, for instance, was fraught with danger for St. Andrews black students. They would go in on the mail van, or which went in to collect the, I don't, does that still happen?
Not as a form of student transportation, so you might need to explain that to them.
I see. They get willing faculty to take
Yes.
it. I see, yes. But local merchants would refuse to serve black students. I think, did I mention the Chopper Charlie?
You've mentioned him to me, yeah, but you haven't here, so.
Yeah. Chopper Charlie was the only barber in town. Well, he was the only barber on Main Street in town. And so our boys unwittingly would go in, and Chopper Charlie would cut white hair, but he wouldn't cut black hair. Said he didn't understand black hair, didn't know how to cut it. you can wait, and I can try, but, you know, and by the time he'd get around to the van would be leaving, and so no black, he had never touched a black head. I always cut my husband's hair. My husband was English and very white. So finally one of the black boys came to me and said, "Mrs. Mead, could you please cut my hair? It's just getting too bushy." I said, "Oh, I've never ever done this. Never cut black hair." Oh, he said, "That's okay. You know, you just cut it and then I'll just pat it in place." And so I fairly quickly became quite expert at cutting black hair because I was certainly a better option than Chopper Charlie was. You know, I remember Earl Walker. I would always cut Earl's hair. You do all sorts of things when you sign up for teaching American. Questions?
Do you want to talk a little bit about helping?
Anti-war, what about
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about your work helping boys to register for conscientious objector status? And again, we haven't had a chance to actually study the Vietnam War in class yet, so you might need to even just sort of fill in a little bit of context for some folks, and about the reaction that registering boys for CO status
You all
got.
know about the Vietnam War, don't you? Yes. And you know that the country was torn up about the Vietnam War. And it was hard times everywhere, except St. Andrew's School. Because here, there was a strong military tradition. There's the War Memorial Bay out here, where some of our alumni are portrayed. There was no draft counseling. It was just assumed that all boys would register for the draft. And there was no provision for any kind of counseling. Well, I had been a draft counselor and had had training when I was a graduate student at Cornell. And so I offered myself as the draft counselor. Well, the administration didn't know what to do with this because it was so different. The idea that you didn't just automatically register. The reg office had all the selective service forms, and they would just, as soon as they turned 16, they would register for the draft. This is what you do. You're an American male, you register for the draft. No, there's a choice. And so I was very proud. My second year, I had the first successful St. Andrews student apply for conscientious objection. He was a boy named Jim Alley. His father was a colonel in the Army who thought the school had sold his family down the river. "What did you do to my boy? I sent my boy a good patriot, and you've turned him against the country." Well, not exactly. So Jim became my first successful conscientious objector registration.
How did the administration respond to the fact that you were doing this and that they had some very upset parents?
They just said, "Well, you know Mrs. Mean, you know, sometimes she just does things." But you know, they're all going to her. It's not compulsory. They just go to her for advice, and so they refused to censor me, which was a wise thing. But boys I would have an open discussion, you know, some Friday evening or something like that in our living room, on draft issues, and it was always full. You know, boys really didn't want to go and fight and die in Vietnam. And they wanted a choice. And so I tried my best. I had a lot of material from the Episcopal Peace Fellowship, which was a branch of the Fellowship of Reconciliation. I had a lot of material that they could read so that they could make up their own minds about this issue. And there was a slow but steady trickle of boys who registered as COs. Not many, but you know, enough to show that there was still freedom of thought.
Was there conflict among students? Were students talking a lot about Vietnam on campus? Were they were aware of and following what was happening?
They were. And there was such a disconnect between what the older St. Andrews faculty, all of whom were military, had done military service, what their feeling about war was, and what the students were feeling. And of course the younger faculty. And teaching was a, what?
A deferment for that, or?
Yes, teaching was a deferment. So we were full of applicants, young men who wanted to avoid the draft, not on conscientious reasons, but just to get out of the draft, want to come and teach. And so it made for difficulties. Not so much among mothers, let me tell you, but there were a fair number of military fathers who said, "What are you doing down there? What are you teaching our boys?" And the headmaster said, No, we're not teaching them anything. We have open meetings for anyone who's interested in exploring options. That's all it is. I remember going in, Middletown, Delaware is not exactly the hub of liberal thought of the East. And I remember going to the Middletown Draft Board with a few students. And the Middletown Draft Board consisted of old VFW, old American Legion vets, who gave our boys quite a hard time in interviewing them. But I must say they had been well prepared. Peace marches. I took people that, by the time we came, the big days of the 60s was pretty much gone. I had gone down to Washington as a demonstrator in the great big 67 and 1970 mobilizations. I heard John Kerry speak on the steps of the Capitol. Wonderful big demonstrations. Oh, it was so exciting. Coming from a place where I, here at St. Andrews, was the only voice for ending the Vietnam War. To come from here to find millions of people, literally, against the war was just such a heartening experience for me.
Questions that you guys have about any of these things? Again, particularly if any of you are thinking about looking at coeducation for the project. Questions that you have?
So this kind of goes back to what we were talking about before when the South was finally desegregated. But I was just wondering, when more minorities finally started attending the school, How are they treated in the classroom? How were they treated in class by the faculty and by other students?
Oh, there was no problem, no problem. Because I think most of our WASP children, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, had come from schools where there were some Asians. But the Asians quite quickly became the brightest. They were used to high achievement from the family pressure and their own abilities. And so they saw St. Andrews as a way up and out. And so the Asian students excelled here at St. Andrews. And there was never any discrimination, no problems.
Did African American students, were they equally sort of welcomed in terms of what the attitudes of, and again, I know you weren't here when desegregation initially happened, but I know you were talking about the challenges of not having a critical mass of African American students, but what sense did you get of sort of how their peers were treating African
It was
American
really
students?
hard for the first group. I remember there were 3 African American girls on Lower Pell, and they had hard times. They were the only 3 women of color in the school, and it was just very hard for them. And I would talk to them about, being pioneers and so forth, but it's lonely, and it continued to be lonely for them. Who do you socialize with? Who's from your background? Who can you hang out with? It's hard. And so, yeah.
Can you go over the dates one more time so when you came to the school and then the first year of girls at the school? You probably already said it, but
I'm sorry?
when you came to the school, what was the date?
I came in 73,
Okay,
fall of 73.
okay. And then girls came the year after.
The year after.
Okay.
So we had a year of planning for something that we had no idea what we were doing. Oh, rewriting all the school materials was nothing. Dealing with toilets and locks on doors, oh my dear. And then dealing with buckets of water being thrown in your window. Not a lot of fun.